Hello and welcome to the first Egypt Centre Zoom lecture. Tonight we're going to be covering the introduction to the Egypt Centre, including the history and the highlights. For those of you that haven't been to the Egypt Centre before or don't know where it is, perhaps you're from outside of the UK, the Egypt Centre is located in Swansea, which is in the area of Wales. So around about 300 miles or so to the west of London. Not in England, but in Wales. And it's located on the South Wales coast, as you can see from the photo on the right-hand side, where you've got the entrance to the Egypt Centre on the top, and on the bottom you've got an aerial view of the Swansea area showing Singleton campus. The arrow is located just where the Egypt Centre is located, and you can see that it's got the nice scenery of the beach just to the left of it. So certainly it's a beautiful place to visit in the summer when it's nice and sunny. In the winter, it's often a little bit dreary and wet. So if you are coming to visit us, I'd certainly recommend coming in the summer and taking advantage of the nice weather. The Egypt Centre collection goes back to that of Sir Henry Solomon Wellcome, who was born in Wisconsin in 1853. Centre wouldn't exist today. Wellcome came to the UK and in 1880 set up Burroughs Wellcome and Co., which many of you will have heard of before. He was a pharmaceutical engineer, and while most of his time was spent dealing with medical issues and creating various drugs, etc., he also collected on a grand scale, and he was very much a hoarder. As you will see with some of the slides coming up in this lecture. He was knighted in 1932 for his contribution to medical science, and upon his death in 1936, he established his will established the Wellcome Trust, which is still in existence today, in which the Wellcome trustees were responsible for distributing and looking after the material that he left, including his purchases, his objects, as well as his various properties and wealth. Early on, he established the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum, and here you can see a photograph of the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum taken in the early 20th century. Again, as I say, it wasn't just the Egyptology stuff that he collected or medical stuff, but he had a wide variety of objects from all over the world. He was really a hoarder of objects. A lot of the early stuff, really between the 1920s and late 1930s, were catalogued at the Wellcome Institute. So they had a series of Wellcome accession registers, which you can see on the right-hand side. And a lot of the objects were given Wellcome slips, flimsy slips as they're commonly called. So you can see the one on the right-hand side here, in which it's describing a vessel of aragonite. So around about a few 100,000 of these objects were given a Wellcome number, which you see up on the top left-hand side, 15761. And these can often be very useful for trying to reconstruct the history of the collection. Which I won't go into any great detail here. But just to give you a flavour of how large the collection of Wellcome was, when he died, there was supposedly 12,000 packing cases containing objects. Of course, it's difficult to know how many objects were in each one. Some may have had several hundred, some perhaps only one or two objects, depending on their sizes. And in addition to this, there were many other freestanding objects that were in the museum itself. After the Second World War, the objects were dispersed to, I think it's around about 150 or so institutions. And you can see from the photograph on the left-hand side some of the ethnographic collections that were laid out in the British Museum in 1955. So you can really see how many objects that there are from this ethnographic collection. He had around about 1 million objects is the estimate. Now you may think, well, how many is 1 million objects, and how does that compare to other museums? By comparison, around about the same year that Wellcome died, just a few years beforehand, the Louvre only had 1/5 of the amount of items. So this was really a vast collection, most of which was kept in boxes and warehouses, many of which had never been opened from the time they were initially collected, many of which were coming from auction sales. It wasn't until 1959 that David Marshall Dixon was appointed by the Wellcome Institute in order to research and document and to some extent catalogue the Egyptian material. So he did this for around about 5 years before the Egyptian material, along with a few other bits and pieces, were transferred to the Petrie Museum in 1964. I don't know if we have anybody from the Petrie Museum who's in on this today, but if you are, then I'm sure many of you will know, will have known David Dixon. Quite interestingly as well, around about 2004, Swansea University received a donation from David Dixon of a lot of his archival papers and photographs and so, which just in the last 2 months were transferred for keeping to the Egypt Centre. So this is certainly something that we will be looking at once we get back into the Egypt Centre building. There's a lot of really interesting stuff among that. He was a Welsh-born Egyptologist from North Wales and a fluent Welsh speaker, which is quite an important thing, which I'll come back to in just a few minutes' time. David Dixon from 1959 wrote a series of reports for the director of the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum. And I've just singled this letter out, which I thought was quite interesting when I was going through them several months ago. In particular, you'll notice on the page on the right-hand side that it talks about the most important items so far examined are the 11 cases of Sudan material. And he talks about how there's a list of these objects. This is material that is coming from Merowe. And the cases themselves hadn't been opened since the time they arrived in London in around about 1911, 1912 or so. So it's 50 years later that here we have Dixon opening these boxes, seeing the material that is there, most of which was retained by the Petrie Museum, although there are some objects that made it to Swansea. The other interesting thing is on the left-hand page, right down at the very bottom, under the number 3A you have there, where it talks about a 5th dynasty limestone lintel from a mastaba at Saqqara. Well, this is the lintel that I'm going to be discussing in my talk on Tuesday evening, the lintel of Chinti. So you can see at this stage he had singled it out as being one of the most important objects from the boxes that he had already gone through. And this was as early as November, December 1959, shortly after he had actually started work at the Wellcome Institute. The next connection with the history of the collection is with John Gwyn Griffiths. John Gwyn Griffiths was at the time, 1970, a reader of classics at Swansea University. Gwyn Griffiths was very good friends with David Dixon, and sometime towards the end of 1970, they had a phone conversation in Welsh, which is described as being a secret conversation in which they pretty much hatched plans to have some of the collection, the Wellcome collection, which was now housed at UCL, to be transferred to Swansea. David Dixon was very keen on a portion of the finds to go to Wales because of his Welsh connections. It was initially offered to Cardiff Museum, who said they didn't have the facilities to support it. And then he subsequently asked Gwyn Griffiths, who he knew very well. They had this conversation in Welsh. Gwyn Griffiths then got in touch with the various powers at Swansea College, as it was at the time. And after negotiations, it was agreed that a portion of the collection would be sent to Swansea. So the conditions were that in February 1951, when the agreement was signed by UCL on behalf of the Wellcome trustees, is that Swansea had to receive the boxes unopened and the contents unknown. So they couldn't pick and choose the objects. They basically had to take what was given to them, which was really a mix of everything. But in total, there were 72 cases, of over 4,500 objects. So this is a large quantity of objects. The Egyptian collection itself was really dispersed between 5 museums between 1969 and 71. So the Petrie Museum kept a lot of the objects themselves, mainly the Sudanese objects from Merowe, while the rest of around about 4,000 to 4,500 objects each were transferred to Swansea, Liverpool, Durham and Birmingham. So they're the main institutions that received the Egyptian collection. There were further objects which were later distributed to other museums in the early 1960s, which I won't go into. When the collection arrived in Swansea, it fell on the responsibility of Kate Boss-Griffiths to curate the collection. Kate Boss-Griffiths was a German-born Egyptologist who had to flee Berlin before the Second World War because of her Jewish heritage. She had worked in the Berlin Museum before, so she had a lot of museum experience, and she was also the honorary curator of archaeology at the Royal Institution in South Wales, now known as Swansea Museum. If you are coming to the lecture series that we are doing through the Egypt Centre, then our curator, Carolyn Graves-Brown, will be talking in a few weeks' time about the Royal Institution in South Wales and the early history surrounding the Egyptian collection that you have there. Swansea Museum is separate from the Egypt Centre. A lot of people think that it's the same thing. It's actually not. It's 2 separate buildings of over a mile apart with different collections and different curators for anybody that doesn't really know about that. So she was appointed as the honorary curator. Here you can see her holding one of our Ptah or Osiris figures. Certainly not the way that we would handle objects nowadays. We would certainly have gloves on, but those were different times. The condition of the loan was that the collection should be made available for research students and that part of it should be shown to the public. Another interesting thing that was part of it was that labels should be written in Welsh as well as English. And this was 1971, long before the introduction of bilingual labels was established in museums or made compulsory in museums in Wales. When the objects came to Swansea, obviously 92 crates of 4,500 objects, they all had to be unpacked. There wasn't a museum at Swansea at the time, so the dean of the college fortunately allowed Kate Boss-Griffiths to use one of the chemistry labs, which you can see here. So here's some of the some of the objects that have been unpacked. On the left-hand side on the table, you can see a number of stone objects. These are offering tables and other pieces from Merowe. We have a nice gold mask, which I'll show you later. You can see it also on the right-hand side. While on the far back here, you can see this large Amarna pot. This will be dealt with in the last lecture, which is going to be in July, the beginning of July, by our Cardiff conservation team. Some of the objects that you see here, such as the stela, will be featuring in subsequent weeks. The objects also came with some documentation, in many cases very limited, but this documentation can be quite useful in terms of reconstructing the object history, particularly where the objects may have originated from. We do have some of this documentation still at the Egypt Centre. So just a few months ago, while I was going through some boxes, I came across this slip. It may not look so exciting, but what it is basically is a case with a list of objects that were placed within it. The numbers that you see here are welcome numbers. In the last few years, the Welcome have put all of their flimsy slips online, and they're available for free for people to download. There's around about 200,000 of them, give or take. And a lot of times the objects came to Swansea with their welcome slips. Others didn't have slips or didn't have welcome numbers associated with them. So because I knew that this box had arrived in Swansea, I decided to go through all of these numbers in order to see if there were any that we didn't have details about. And one of the numbers here is related to this slip. which describes a mask and cover of a mummy in linen, representing a Christian deacon, and then it goes on to give more details about it. From this description, just a few months ago, it was possible to find the object that belongs with it. So we're learning more about the history of our collection, thanks to the Welcome, who have recently put their slips and other archival material online. This is one of our so-called Deir el-Bahri shrouds, which dates to the Roman period. It's one of two that we have in the collection, both of which were published around about 15 years ago by Christina Riggs in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. With the collection itself, Welcome bought from auction. Sometimes he'd buy one or two choice pieces, but in most cases, he was buying hundreds, sometimes thousands of objects. He had a lot of money as a very wealthy individual. I've got a list of the various people who he bought objects from, which I think I'll do for the blog post that I have coming up on Monday. But one of the most well-known characters is the Reverend William McGregor, who you see on the left-hand side, who had one of the most important, if not the most important, private collection that was known at the time. And it was sold at auction over almost 10 days of close to 2,000 lots in 1922. Now, Welcome was responsible for buying a quarter of the objects from that collection. He didn't buy the most important objects in it. He would pretty much scoop up anything else that people weren't buying. But there are a number of important objects for this. We will be having a talk in a few weeks' time by Bev Rogers, who will be talking about McGregor for anybody that is interested in that. But it's really interesting to actually trace the history of the objects and see the people that were associated with them. The Reverend William McGregor is quite well known, but I suspect none of you will know who the person is on the right-hand side. I certainly didn't know who he was and just found out about him recently because we have around about 7 objects in our collection which come from his auction sale, including 5 bracelets from Gebel. His name is George Henry Weiss, and he's the first Great Britain boxing champion and the founding member and president of the Amateur Boxing Association. So not all these people who collected objects were associated with archaeology, with Egyptology and so on. This guy was a boxer. So it's nice to kind of recreate the history and to find out more about these people who were involved in collecting the objects themselves. That's just 2 of the people that we have. Another one who I'm particularly keen in is a very obscure and mysterious guy called Robert de Rastaffiel, who went by several names. That's a whole other lecture in its own right. But on the left-hand side, you see a plate here from his 1906 sale. He sold objects over 5 auctions. The Egypt Centre have objects from the 1906, 1907 and 1913 sales. And altogether, it's probably around about 1,000 objects in our collection, which are originating from the McGregor, from the Rastaffiel sales. What I'm really keen on doing is trying to trace where a lot of these objects are today. Not just those that are in the Egypt Centre, but in other museums. So over Christmas, while I was back home in Belfast, I decided to overlay a number of the photographs that we have in various collections on top of the original images themselves. So you can see I've only put 4 on here. One of the photographs, number 2 on the list, is in the Egypt Centre. This one is in the Petrie Museum, while the other 2 down here are in the British Museum. And I hope you can see my pointer as well here. The majority of the other objects that you've got here, the paintings, are in the Berlin Museum. So we do know where they are. I just don't have the photographs from them. And here's another one from the plates that I did over Christmas, with 2 of the objects appearing here in the Egypt Centre collection, one of which I'll be showing later, which is this large painted relief depicting Kaba Kenet, one of the workmen at Deir el-Medina. Another piece that we have up the top here from the temple of Tutmosis III at Gurna, and the majority of the other pieces are from Liverpool and the British Museum. But it's really nice to actually see them in fresh light and to see what they really look like today, and to really trace the history of the collection and the dispersal of the objects. The dispersal of the objects is also a big issue when you deal with stuff from Welcome. So here you can see that we have two shapties on the left-hand side, belonging to a man called Amenhotep, who was a scribe of the Ramesses period. The two shapties are in the Egypt Centre collection, along with another 18. We have 2 overseers plus 18 servants. And they were sold in 1924 as part of the Reverend Franklin Hood collection, as 2 separate lots. 2 lots of 10 shapties, which were accompanied by shapty boxes, 2 shapty boxes. But because of the dispersal of the Welcome objects, the 20 shapties ended up in Swansea, whereas the 2 shapty boxes, one of which you can see on the right-hand side, have ended up in Birmingham. So it's really unfortunate that we have all the shapties, they have the 2 shapty boxes, rather than perhaps them having 1 shapty box and 10 shapties, and us likewise. But perhaps something could be done about that in the future. So continuing our history of the Egypt Centre collection, we saw that initially the collection was kept in a science lab, but in 1976, the Swansea Welcome Museum was officially opened to the public. So 5 years after the collection arrived in Swansea, a room was made available in North Arts, as it was at the time. It's now Keir Hardy. For any Swansea students that are here, or anybody who knows Keir Hardy well, it was Keir Hardy room number 115, which is now a seminar room. But here you can see the official opening in 1976. On the far left-hand side, we have Gwyn Griffiths. You have Kate Boss Griffiths in the centre, next to one of our so-called slipper coffins. And on the right-hand side is a man that many of you will probably recognise, also with a Welsh connection. This is Harry James, who at the time was the keeper of Egyptian antiquities in the British Museum. He's a Welsh native from just down the road at Port Talbot, I believe. So the museum was open to the public for 2 days a week, but for a limited amount of hours compared to what it is now. The collection was made available for students and researchers, so it's quite interesting to read the guest books that Kate kept at the time of the various scholars who visited the collection. There were quite a lot. The Griffiths had good collections with Egyptologists, with Egyptologists in the UK, Europe, America, as well as Egypt and other places. So you can see a few of the displays that you have here. One of my favorite archival photographs that we have in the collection is the one on the right-hand side, which is showing our display case of the dawn of history. You may recognize the person who's holding this little pottery boat in his hand. This is a very young Professor Alan Lloyd, taken around about 1976, who's now retired, but still active in Swansea. The collection itself is not just objects from the Welcome collection, although that forms the core base of the Egypt Centre of 4,500 objects. We have almost 6,000 objects in total. We've got donations from the Egypt Exploration Society, some of which came in 1978 via the British Museum, others which came from Cardiff Museum, from Aberystwyth, and then we have this coffin which came from Exeter. It came from Exeter in 1982, and it's certainly one of our real treasures in the collection. It belongs to a songstress of Amun of the 21st dynasty, a very typical yellow type coffin of the 21st dynasty, and her name is Amenhotep. It came to us in a very poor state of preservation, so you can see in the photograph on the right-hand side, Kate cleaning it a bit. You can see that woodworm and destruction has really kind of affected the coffin badly, and at the time had affected the mummy. But in the early 1980s, shortly after arriving in Swansea, it was sent to Cardiff University for conservation. You will hear more about the Cardiff conservation in a little bit, as well as in a subsequent lecture. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that funding was received from the Heritage Lottery Fund, as well as the European Regional Development Fund, in order to create a purpose-built museum. So here you can see the workers sorting out the foundations for the building, which is going to be attached to the Taliesin Arts Theatre. And then in 1998, the museum was officially opened to the public. And here you can see the people who were involved in the opening. Again, we have Alan Lloyd with slightly grayer hair. We have our curator, current curator, Carolyn Graves Brown, at the back, and we have Sybil Crouch, who was the manager of the Taliesin Arts Centre, who was a big supporter of the Egypt Centre and was really instrumental in setting up the Egypt Centre through acquiring funding, who sadly passed away in early January. So the Egypt Centre itself as a museum is less than 22 years old, but the collection goes back to almost 50 years. In fact, next year, we're going to be celebrating 50 years of the collection being in Swansea. We have two galleries. We have the House of Death, which is downstairs. Here you can see a view here. The coffin of US Amenhotep is just off to the left-hand side, and you can see various other coffins that are appearing in the cases there. And we have the House of Life, which is upstairs. We not only have objects in the collection, but we have a very talented and large team of volunteers, without whom the Egypt Centre wouldn't be able to be the success that it is today. So in the photograph that you see here, you can see one of our, in fact, she was our oldest volunteer at the time. She's now recently retired, Barbara. I won't give her full age, but when this photograph was taken, she was in her 90s. While on the right-hand side, we have one of her, at the time, one of our youngest volunteers. Our youngest volunteers start, the newbies as they're called, from 10 years of age. And this volunteer that we have here is quite aptly named Seth. So that's Seth, along with Barbara. A few years ago, we were awarded the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service, which is a very unique and interesting, important award that we received, which is basically the equivalent of an MBE for volunteering for groups. So we have won a lot of awards over the years for our volunteering program, and I know that some of our volunteers will be in on this Zoom lecture today. So on behalf of the Egypt Centre, thank you to everybody who volunteers. We've had a lot of visitors in the past, important ones, including royalty. Around about 10 years ago, we had Prince Charles and Camilla visit, and they were able to handle some real Egyptian objects with the children, some of the child volunteers and school groups that we had working on that day. And they really enjoyed it, I think, as you can probably see from the photographs here, although Camilla looks a little hesitant on putting on the gloves. We do welcome researchers to visit the collection, to research the objects that we have there. We're always open to people to visit. So here you can see two people who visited recently. On the left-hand side, we have Megan Clark, who came several months ago in order to examine our paddle dolls, as they're commonly called. And Megan will be given a lecture in a few weeks' time on our paddle doll, building it into her larger research of paddle dolls for her PhD. While on the right-hand side, you may recognize Aaron de Souza, who came to us last August in order to examine our large collection of Armant pottery. This is objects that is coming from the EES excavations from the 1930s. Those of you that were on the Zoom lecture earlier from the EES will have seen Carl talk about the dig house at the site. The majority of the excavations, the objects from this particular excavation, were transferred to Swansea in 1971. Aaron has kindly offered to give a lecture on the material that he looked at, as well as that in the bigger picture from Armant, and that will be coming up again in a few weeks' time towards the end of May. Our most recent visit, just shortly before the lockdown, was Manon Schutz from Oxford, who came to examine our bed legs as part of her PhD thesis. Two of the most interesting bed legs that we have in the collection are those on the left-hand side, which come from Akhmim, and they depict the deities Tawaret and Bes. And these are really unique. I won't talk about them now because Manon will be talking about them in a few weeks' time. We do a lot of education with school groups, so they can be young children. As you can see here, they come, they play Senet, they do a mummification, they get to dress up. And it's really inspiring for young children to get them interested in Egyptology at a young age, and to take them out of the classroom to do that. We do a lot of education with adults, with students. So quite recently I did a module on the Amarna period, but looking at the Amarna period through the Egypt Center objects, of which we have around about 250 objects, mainly coming from the EES donations to Henry Wellcome, as well as those that were acquired in 1978. And there you can see some of the objects that we have there. And this brings me to my second poll, which I'm going to do very quickly. Hopefully that poll had gone away earlier. We are thinking of doing a course on the funerary artifacts of ancient Egypt, but through the Egypt Center objects. And I'd be interested to see whether people would be interested in this particular course. We would do it as a 5-week course, 2-hour sessions each, at £40. Although we're given these sessions for free, we do unfortunately have to make some money, and we do rely very heavily on our educational groups or conferences and so on in order to raise an income. So if people are interested in this, then it is a course that I would be willing to start in, let's say, a few weeks' time or so. And it looks like quite a lot of people have responded very positively. So that is something that I will be looking at. So thank you very much for that. I will just quickly show you the results before we move on, because I realize that we are quickly running out of time. So let me close that. We work very closely. Here's just a few photographs of some of the courses that I have taught on the funerary artifacts of Egypt. So you can see the students, some are volunteers, some are retired people, get to handle the objects. Something you won't be able to do through this course, but you'll be able to appreciate the collection that we have even more through the sessions. We work with the department by making objects available for MA students, undergrads, PhD students, as you can see with some of the photographs that we have here. It's really a hands-on approach that we do. We believe very firmly on object-centered learning as a way for people to really understand the past and the material culture better, rather than simply looking at images. You can certainly get a lot more detail, a lot more information from examining the objects in person, rather than simply looking at photographs. We collaborate with other departments and colleagues. So last year we did a collaboration with Ersin Hussein and Liz Sekhmet in Swansea University in order to XRF a number of her objects, in particular coins, in which we were looking at bronze content. So that was quite fun and something that we'll hopefully do more of. That helped us to purchase a number of the display boards, interpretation panel, which are now on display in our galleries. So one for metalworking and the other for the Predynastic period. And here you can see the two display boards that have been put in place. That was thanks to funding which Ersin received from Swansea University as part of seed funding that she received for the metals project. So we're very grateful for Ersin, who will be given a presentation in a few weeks' time also. We work very closely with Cardiff University with their conservation department. So each year we send objects to Cardiff in order for the students to conserve as part of their MA and undergraduate scheme under the careful supervision of Phil Parks and the rest of his team. So on the left-hand side, you can see one of our model boats that was sent. The main reason for sending this was to have it x-rayed, because we were very curious as to whether it was fake, it was embellished in more recent times, and also to attach the two figures that you can see standing on top of the boat, which are loose. And on the right-hand side, I won't talk about this too long because John Rogers, one of our PhD students at Swansea, will be talking about this whistle in just over a week's time. And it's a really fascinating and one of the most unique objects that we have in the collection. So if you haven't already signed up for that one, do. It's a really interesting lecture. Recently, I accompanied a group of students down to Cardiff in order to see some of the conservation work that was going on. In particular, to have a look at our 25th, 26th dynasty coffin that we have there, belonging to a man called Ankpa. So you can see the inside of the lid of the coffin on the right-hand side, and here's the base of the coffin just there, which is currently undergoing conservation. We're hoping that this is going to be finished in say 4 years or so, 5 years or so. Phil Parks, who you can see just on the left, will be talking about this coffin at the beginning of July as part of this series, so you'll hear more about that. We recently received a grant of almost £5,000 to carry out conservation work on our objects. So the large Amarna pot that I mentioned earlier is currently in Cardiff undergoing conservation. We will have Ashley, who is the conservator responsible for this conservation grant, who will be talking jointly with Phil Parks on the conservation grant that was from the AIM, Association of Independent Museums, and the Pilgrim Trust. So we're very grateful for both AIM and the Pilgrim Trust for this donation, which really goes a long way for us as a small museum. The figures that you see on the right-hand side, I won't talk about, but you can see there are lots of little wooden figures with now refound limbs. Sam Powell will be talking about these in a few weeks' time. And during this lockdown, we've been trying to really highlight the collection as much as possible for people, make it accessible to people. And I think one of the great successes has been these jigsaw puzzles, which I know a lot of people are quite obsessed with and get upset when I don't post them on Facebook and Twitter within a certain time. So this is something that we'll continue to do, and it's nice to see that other museums, as well as the EES, have been doing these puzzles. I think they're really great way of learning about the collection. So what I'll do now for the next, 15 minutes or so, is I'm just going to briefly show you some slides highlighting some of the objects that we have in the collection, mainly from a chronological point of view. So from the Predynastic period, we have this very interesting and fairly unique statue on the left-hand side, made out of stone. And although you do have some during the Predynastic period, the majority of them are made out of ivory. So because we have this one made out of stone, which comes from the 1913 Raphael sale, a lot of Egyptologists have questioned its authenticity. It was recently published in a paper by Stan Hendricks and Carolyn Graves Brown and others, in which they're fairly convinced that it is actually a genuine one and that there is a parallel one, they often come in pairs, which is in France. While on the right-hand side, you can see our little D-ware vessel, which was purchased by Wellcome in 1922 from the collection of the Reverend Henry McGregor. At the time, it was in many pieces. Well, actually, the photograph shows it restored. So this break that you've got here, that's something that was done prior to 1922. But it is a beautiful little D-ware vessel. From the Old Kingdom, we have this lintel of Chente, which you see on the top. One of the most interesting objects from a historical point of view in terms of recreating its life history. So this is why I'll be talking about this in the second lecture, which is coming up on Tuesday. While down the bottom, we have a reserve head, one of only 37 reserve heads in the world. So this is a very unique object. Unfortunately, it's very weathered, as you can see here. And because of the weathering, Egyptologists again often question the authenticity of it. However, it's not the only one that is shown with this weathering pattern. And this one was purchased by Wellcome in 1928, which is before a lot of these reserve heads had been discovered at Giza. So if you're going to fake something, if you're going to forge something, you're going to do something that is well known rather than something that people didn't really know much about. So I think it's genuine. From the Middle Kingdom, we've got the paddle doll on the right-hand side, which, like I say, will be discussed about by Megan Clark in a few weeks' time. But note in particular, just below the sticker, and this is a recent discovery that we made just within the last year through good lighting on the object, when we noticed that there was a little frog that was decorated on the back. And as far as I'm aware, this is unique to paddle dolls, but Megan will be able to answer that either in the chat today or in her talk in a few weeks' time. On the left-hand side, we have an object, a necklace, which is, an anklet actually, which is coming from Petrie's excavations at Cow. And you can see it's really beautiful here, but note in particular the amethyst scarab that you've got here. The amethyst which is coming from the excavations or the mining of Wadi El Hudi to the south of Egypt. We know from the records that this was actually found on the body of a woman, and it's one of a number of pieces belonging to this particular grave, which are now in the Egypt Centre. From the New Kingdom, we have this really nice relief. Some of you may have read about this a few years ago when it made the BBC News as being highlighted as being a relief of Hatshepsut. It's not actually Hatshepsut, it's her daughter Neferu Re. And while I don't have time to go into all the complexities and how this was identified, I will be giving a lecture on this in around about a month's time. So you'll have more details about this, including discussing why you have this representation of a man on the back of it, which you may think is a bit strange. But I'll explain all that next month. In a few weeks' time, you'll hear Aidan Dodson talk about these two particular fragments, which a lot of Egyptologists get quite excited about when they visit the Egypt Centre collection, because they are two fragments of the inner sarcophagus of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the most important and well-known official during the reign of Amenhotep III, who later became deified and worshipped as a god of healing. So it's quite rare, really, to have these important pieces in their collection. They don't join with one another. But in fact, the one on the right-hand side joins with a piece which is in Brussels. So the fragments are scattered in various museums, including the Egypt Centre, Brussels, and others, which Aidan will be telling you about in a few weeks. We have a lot of objects from the Amarna period, which I mentioned earlier. One of the most beautiful and well-known is this broad collar. It's one of 4 collars that we have in the collection, which come from the sale of Lady Behrens in 1923. What's unique about this one is the representation of the Bess, or Bessette figure at the front. This is a female Bess. And female Bess figures are fairly well known during the Amarna period. The suggestion that was made by Cyril Aldred in the 1970s to Kate Boss Griffiths is that these 4 collars were taken from the bodies of the Amarna princesses when the royal tombs were being robbed in 1881. Of course, we don't know whether this is the case or not. We do like to tell visitors that these are potentially from the bodies of Tutankhamun's sisters, because a lot of people like to have a story associated with objects. And another interesting object that we have from the Amarna period is this very small piece of stela. And you're probably looking at that and thinking, well, it's not so attractive. It's not really that interesting. And to see it, it's not so interesting. It is quite small. But a few years ago, while I was preparing a lecture for the students on the Amarna period and objects that we have in the collection, as I was flicking through a book, I realized that it seems to potentially join with another fragment, which is in Berlin. This is what I was due to be talking about at the conference next month. I'll postpone that for another time, mainly because we have sent a cast of our object 3D print of our object to Berlin, and we're waiting for them to inform us whether it joins or not. But in terms of the break, the crack, the size, the writing, one of the words which appears on both fragments, written back to front on both occasions. The only time I've been able to find that from over 100 instances from Amarna, it seems to potentially go together. And this would be quite interesting because, of course, the stela fragment that we have from Berlin does have a representation of Akhenaten and Nefertiti in quite an affectionate pose. So if we were to get a nice cast of that for our own gallery, it would certainly highlight the object and make it even more important in our case. We have this nice Ramesside statue. It's quite small actually, but you can see from the inscription on the back that it is beautifully carved. There's still a lot of dirt, in particular you can see up the top that we have here. So the object was recently sent to Cardiff for conservation and cleaning, and I'm really interested to see the hieroglyphs afterwards, because you can see that there's still really nice painted blue hieroglyphs that you've got there. So once that's cleaned, it'll look even better. And again, it's really interesting to get these objects for handling sessions, because when we had this one last year, one of the students noticed that just over the shoulder of the man, you have the traces of his wife's hand, fingers. Now, looking at the statue, you may think that initially it was just one person. We now know from just the traces of the fingers there that this was a double statue of a man and a woman. The titles that we have here indicate that it's someone of great importance, perhaps a vizier, perhaps even someone like Passer, who you can see in this next slide on the left-hand side. Passer was one of the most important officials during the reign of Seti I and Ramesses II. And on the left-hand side, you've got a little statue base that we have in the collection. So the two holes are where his feet would have been located, and you can see his various titles. He's the overseer of the city, and he's the vizier, Passer. The object on the right-hand side is an offering stand of another well-known Ramesside person called Paneb. Paneb is an official who most of you have probably heard of before. This is our criminal of the Egypt Center and of Deir el-Medina, who's accused of many things, including robbing the tombs, sleeping with married women, threatening to kill people, possibly killing people. The list goes on and on. But this is our offering stand from Deir el-Medina. And another object from Deir el-Medina is this painted limestone relief depicting the chief, one of the workmen, Kaba Kenet, who you can see here. Now, you may not have heard of Kaba Kenet before, but you will have heard of his father, because his father is none other than Sennacherib, whose tomb most of you will have visited at Deir el-Medina, Theban tomb number 1. Kaba Kenet's tomb is number 2 at Deir el-Medina. Here he is accompanied by his wife, and they're in front of the gods Ptah, Ptah Sokar, and just a little bit here we have the goddess Isis. So this is a really interesting relief coming from the 1907 Rostafel sale. Moving into the late period, we have a statue of the priest Abba or Ibi on the left-hand side, made out of limestone, while on the right we have this Ptolemaic queen. Now, the identity of the queen is unknown. Although it does have a back pillar, it's completely uninscribed, which is really unfortunate. Stylistically, it dates to the early Ptolemaic period, so it could be, let's say, for example, Berenike II, and perhaps with a closer examination of the styles, it could be narrowed down even further. Both of these objects come from the collection of the Reverend William McGregor, who I said Bev Rogers will be talking about in a few weeks' time. We have this really beautiful faience statue. It's only around about 10 centimeters in height, but really beautiful. It depicts the goddess Sekhmet, whose head is now missing, accompanied by her son Nefertum. We know that from the inscription that we have on the back, in which we have a series of prayers for well-being issued by Sekhmet and Nefertum, but a very beautiful piece. At the minute, we don't know who this collection or whose collection this object comes from, but possibly the Reverend William McGregor, since he had a vast collection of faience objects, but more research is needed in order to establish that. We only have one section of papyrus in the collection, which is currently in Cardiff for conservation, but this is the papyrus of Ankapi that we have. Although it's only a small section, which has chapters 15a to h of the Book of the Dead, as well as the vignette at the top, the pictures, which is chapter 1 of the Book of the Dead, the adjoining piece on the right-hand side is in the British Museum, while another piece is in a private collection in Cambridge, Massachusetts. From the later periods of Egyptian history, going into the Ptolemaic and Roman period, we have a lot of objects, including this really nice gold mask on the left-hand side, this cartonnage with golden face. And on the left, this is one of two coffin fragments that we have, perhaps from the same coffin. And a lot of Egyptologists, well, not Egyptologists, but visitors, when they come here, and even some Egyptologists, they often think that the hieroglyphs above don't make any sense, that this is obviously a fake. But in fact, you can read the inscription that is on top here. It's a well-known coffin style, which comes from the site of Tuna El Gebel, and some of them have been published before. So this is certainly not a fake object. A lot of people think because the museum is called the Egypt Center that we only have Egyptian objects in the collection. That's not true. We have a lot of objects from the classical world. Here's just a few that I'm showing you on here, from Cyprus, from Greece, from Mesopotamia, and so on. So the nice little horse that you see in the center here is from Cyprus. And I think Urson will be talking about this in June when she gives a lecture on that. I mentioned earlier that we have a few objects from Meroe. So just to mention a couple, only because I photographed them just before the lockdown and made quite an interesting discovery. This was one of the pieces. We didn't have any documentation for this object. We didn't know where it was from, although because of the quality of the sandstone, we suspected that it was coming from Meroe. And then one day I was looking through the publication, the 1911 publication of Garstang, when I noticed that you had this block in the archives. And as you can see, this is the left-hand side of the piece. Well, we have the left-hand side of the piece, which was complete in 1910 when it was photographed. Since then, I've been able to find that the other fragment is in the Petrie Museum. So again, this was part of the division of finds. Obviously, at some point, the object broke. The Petrie kept the larger piece. We ended up with a small piece. And the same thing has happened with this piece. Again, we had no details of the provenance, the details. And it was only because recently I mentioned that we had the archives of David Dixon. When I was looking through the archives, I found a photograph from the Wellcome Institute of material from Meroe. And lo and behold, one of the archival photographs with a fragment of a winged figure with the double plumes of a moon. And this fragment is now in the Petrie Museum, but you can see from the archival photograph here that we have two fragments which join together, virtually at least. So I think the timing is pretty good in terms of getting out for just before 8 o'clock. But a reminder of the lectures that are coming up. If you haven't already booked for them, you can do that through our Zoom page. Sam can post the link in the chat for you. And just the last two slides before we stop for a break. You may be interested to know that just over a week ago, I finished producing a little book with the help of others, including one of our volunteers, Dulcie Engel, who played a very important role in this, which is our illustrated guide to the Egypt Center. It's going to be the first of a series of volumes that we're going to produce. This one is on the 30 highlights that were chosen by our volunteers as well as members of the public. If you are interested in this booklet, then you can get it for free. All you need to do is make a donation to the Egypt Center Fund. This is our crowdfunding page that we've recently set up, which, because we rely very heavily on educational, on school visits, on conferences and so on for our funding, because of the COVID outbreak and the lockdown, we are really suffering. So we're pretty much begging you to make a donation. If you make a donation of £5 or more, you get a free copy of the book.